For 9 months, the world waited, knowing Venezuela was headed towards an inflection point, a moment that would either usher in an era of change or else snuff out the last hopes that democracy might ever be restored. Back in October, Nicolas Maduro's socialist government and the opposition sealed a joint accord with the US known as the Barbados Agreement. In exchange for Caracas holding free and fair elections in 2024, Uncle Sam would ease the sanctions choking Venezuela's oil industry. From that moment, the countdown was on until July the 28th, till the moment that Venezuelans would vote and everyone would see whether the will of the people still mattered. Well, nearly 2 weeks on from that inflection point, we have our answer. Democracy in Venezuela, on life support for so long, is officially dead. And in its place has come chaos. At the time of writing, masked goons are on the streets of Caracas attacking anti-regime protesters. Maduro is railing against supposed plots against him, all while refusing to release the official tallies of votes. Some 24 are dead and thousands more have been arrested. With the atmosphere tense, Venezuelans are wondering if the regime can cling to power, if Maduro really can pull off what might be the largest electoral fraud in Latin American history. Because the alternative is the sort of uprising like we just saw in Bangladesh, a wave of people power that unseats an autocrat who has become increasingly repressive. And make no mistake, which of these two paths Venezuela chooses in the next few weeks could have an impact that is felt across the whole of the Americas. Now, to understand why, we first need to sketch out the background to the July 28th vote. To give you a sense of how Maduro came to hold elections, he must have always known he was planning to steal. After all, the Barbados Agreement of October 2023 didn't come out of nowhere. The only reason the regime initially signed up to it was because the country was in a state of economic collapse. Here are some figures. According to the Council on Foreign Relations, Venezuela's GDP has contracted by 75% over the last 10 years, a contraction that has seen up to 80% of the population plunge into poverty. To put that number in context, the Great Depression of the 1930s saw American GDP contract by 30%. At the time, such a fall felt apocalyptic, and Depression-era Americans didn't even have to deal with hyperinflation. At one point in the 2010s, Venezuelan inflation hit an eye-popping 130,000%. Making all this additionally painful was the fact that Venezuela wasn't always like this. As recently as the 1970s, the nation was booming. Sat atop the world's largest proven oil reserves, it had grown into one of the wealthiest countries in Latin America. Even as late as the 1990s, when economic turbulence triggered violent protests, it was still considered relatively stable. But the rise to power of Hugo Chavez severely weakens the country's institutions. By the time his anointed successor Nicolas Maduro took over in 2013, effective checks and balances had nearly disappeared. After narrowly winning election that same year, Maduro began to remove the last of them, just as economic mismanagement pushed the country off the cliff edge. You've probably heard what followed next. The fraudulent election of 2018, the exodus of up to a quarter of the population, the soaring homicide rate which made Venezuela the most murderous place in Latin America between 2017 and 2022. Adding to the government's woes were US-imposed sanctions on the country's oil industry, the same sanctions which were partially lifted by the White House to sweeten the deal of the Barbados Agreement. It was this move that seems to have convinced Maduro to hold the 2024 election with a real opposition candidate on the ballot. Although we can't pretend to know the inner workings of the Venezuelan government, the fact that the election offered a genuine choice seems to reflect the regime's assumption that small economic improvements would be enough to bring its base voters out in force. Enough to perhaps even squeak a legitimate win. Just to be sure, though, Caracas banned the main opposition candidate, the highly charismatic Maria Corina Machado, from running. After a hand-picked replacement was also banned, the opposition was left running the uninspired 74-year-old ex-diplomat Edmundo González Urrutia. Maduro's gamble seems to have been that if he just put his thumb on the scales enough, he could produce a win that looked legitimate to the outside world. If that's the case, though, the regime underestimated how much a decade of deprivation had turned the country against it. Despite the relative lack of charisma, opinion polls soon recorded González holding a gigantic lead. How gigantic? Well, Crisis Group reports that González was up 30 points ahead of the vote. Foreign Policy writes that, quoting here, in pre-election public opinion polls, more than 80% of registered voters said they wanted political change, and an almost equal number expressed an intent to vote. The quote ends. Combined with González and Machado drawing vast crowds at rallies in what had once been hardcore Chavista territory, it briefly felt like change might be in the air. In the weeks leading up to July 28th, foreign media outlets wondered if the vote might be too lopsided to steal. But there's a reason we used the word briefly in that previous paragraph there. For all the hopes, for all the voter mobilization, the truth is that Maduro had likely been planning to steal the vote all along. And so it was that around midnight on July the 28th, mere hours after polls closed, the government-controlled National Electoral Council declared that Maduro had won with 52% of the vote to Gonzalez's 43%. So comfortable did the claim of victory seem that some foreign outlets, including the New York Times, initially reported Maduro's re-election as fact. But then a few more hours passed, and people began to notice something very strange. As the New Yorker notes, the announcement was made without publishing a breakdown of vote counts. So here's something you should know about how elections work in Venezuela. Although voters do use machines, the results aren't just sent to some central database that the government can manipulate. Instead, every machine prints out a tally before transmitting its data, what are known as actors. That means that anyone in the country can check the official results against the sheets and see if the reported results are accurate. By law, all participating political parties are entitled to copies of these tally sheets. On July the 28th, though, multiple voting precincts refused to hand them over. The National Electoral Council didn't publish them on its website. Publicly, the Maduro government claims the release had been delayed due to hackers attacking election infrastructure. This, to put it mildly, was unusual. Hugo Chavez was long proud of the fact that his authoritarian rule was backed by voters. Publishing the tallies was a way to prove Venezuela's elections, while manipulated, were not stolen. So, for Maduro to keep them hidden for over a week after the election was fishy in the extreme. Unfortunately for him, the opposition was already working to make the missing actors public. Thanks to a vast ground game, the opposition claims it was able to get a hold of 24,532 tally sheets, or about 79% of the total. In the days since the election, it's been posting them online. While their website was quickly blocked in Venezuela, it's still visible for the international community to see, or anybody with a VPN. In a special report, AP News analyzed the data. While cautioning that they couldn't actually verify the actor's authenticity, they nonetheless said they were able to tabulate over 10.2 million votes. Here is their conclusion, quoting, "According to the calculations, opposition's Edmundo Gonzalez received 6.89 million votes, nearly 500,000 more than the government says Maduro won with. The tabulations also show that Maduro received 3.13 million votes from the tally sheets released." In other words, if the actors posted online by the opposition are genuine, they show Gonzalez didn't just win, but he won by a landslide. Steve Levitsky, an expert on democracy at Harvard University, described the tally sheet as showing that the Maduro government had committed, quote, "one of the most egregious electoral frauds in modern Latin American history." It was an assessment that most of the world seemed to share. The United States declared Gonzalez the election's legitimate winner. The European Union refused to recognize Maduro's claim to victory. Closer to home, multiple Latin American governments questioned the results. In retaliation, Foreign Policy reports that Caracas ordered the shutting of embassies for Argentina, Chile, Costa Rica, the Dominican Republic, Ecuador, Panama, Peru, and Uruguay. That is a hardcore move. Embassies usually remain open in all circumstances except outright war. The Russian embassy in Washington, D.C., for example, is still open today. Speaking of Russia, it won't surprise you to hear which capitals congratulated Maduro on his win. Alongside Moscow, Beijing, Tehran, and Belgrade all welcomed the result. In Latin America, Nicaragua, Cuba, Bolivia, and Honduras accepted the regime's fraud at face value. Perhaps more important, though, are the three major nations that neither accepted nor rejected the results. At the time of writing, Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia have refrained from claiming fraud, but they are pressing Maduro to release the voting tallies. Given that Brazil and Colombia are currently led by leftists with known soft spots for Venezuela, that's potentially a massive problem for Maduro, one that we'll explore in a bit more detail in a moment. For now, though, we want to switch focus from the international reaction to the reaction inside Venezuela, because it's the outpouring of rage on the nation's streets that makes this subject suitable for warographics. That suggests the country could perhaps be heading for a major upheaval. Now, the first thing to note is that the protests gripping Venezuela are different from before, not necessarily in their intensity, but in the areas that are now at the center of the firestorm, former regime strongholds that were deeply loyal to Hugo Chavez. According to The Economist, these strongholds include not just working-class districts in Caracas like Petare, but also former regime bastions outside the capital like Valle Lindo. The Guardian reports that El Valle district, where Maduro himself was raised, is gripped by unrest. Quoting a resident who spoke to their reporter, the newspaper headlined its article with a simple warning, quote, "Maduro has lost the streets." These are places that once delivered 85% of their votes to Hugo Chavez, not due to fraud, but due to Chavez redirecting vast amounts of petrodollars to their impoverished neighborhoods. The sort of places that reliably voted for Maduro as recently as 2018, when the economic meltdown was already underway. Now they're sites of ordinary Venezuelans pulling down statues of Chavez, of angry, roiling demonstrations. And that means they're also the locations where the regime's backlash has begun in earnest. At the time of writing, the government is turning the full force of its security apparatus onto the protesters. The New Yorker reports on videos of plainclothes men dragging people into unmarked SUVs. Armed pro-government groups have been witnessed firing guns into crowds. As of August the 6th, 22 people are thought to have died. Thousands have been arrested, many from working-class communities. By Saturday the 3rd, Maduro was boasting at a rally that 2,000 people had been detained and the police would detain at least another 1,000 more. As El País writes, these numbers are far higher than those of 2017 when there were 4 months of protests. Maduro's rhetoric is also getting harsher, quite a feat given his bombastic nature. In recent speeches, he's vowed to pulverize the protesters and claimed he is, quote, willing to do anything to protect the revolution. That anything seems to include a final crackdown on the opposition. Officers have already been ransacked by the security forces and prominent leaders taken into custody. On August the 5th, Attorney General Tarek Saab declared that he was opening a criminal probe into both Maria Corina Machado and Edmundo Gonzalez Urrutia. The charges came after Machado and Gonzalez penned an open letter asking for the armed forces to switch sides and stand with the Venezuelan people. So far, though, there's no sign of that happening. The Bolivarian Army of Venezuela is at the center of an enormous patronage network that relies on the regime to keep its pockets lined with cash. It's also overseen by a ruthless intelligence service that quickly clamps down on any sign of dissent. Unless the protests become big enough to outweigh both the greed of the officer corps and the fear of its junior ranks, it's hard to see them turning their backs on Maduro. Still, that doesn't mean it's impossible. Just look at Bangladesh, where Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina appeared invincible as she cracked down on similar mass protests, only to suddenly flee the country as the army ordered her to step down. The great hope of Venezuela's protesters is that something similar will happen in Caracas. Although we should note that it's not a hope shared by Gonzalez, who recently wrote an editorial in The Economist claiming, "It would be against my principles and against my lifelong record to advocate any violence, let alone a coup d'etat." But let's park the possibility of the military stepping in for a moment as being less likely. Assuming the army doesn't mount a coup, where might things go from here? For now, the opposition's plan appears to be to focus on the tally sheets as a way of proving to the international community that Gonzalez won the election. By relentlessly focusing on Maduro's refusal to publish them, they likely hope to convince outside actors that something needs to be done. What that something might be, at anybody's guess. The US could, reimpose the oil sanctions it lifted as part of the Barbados Agreement, but that might help Maduro sell his claim that the protests were all part of an imperialist plot. Additionally, as Bloomberg notes, it's not clear that the Biden administration would risk rattling the energy market and potentially pushing up gasoline prices for US drivers ahead of the November 5th US presidential vote. A more constructive intervention might involve Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico mediating between the two sides. As we said earlier, Brasilia and Bogota are already pressuring Maduro to release the actors, and the foreign ministers of all three nations are due in Caracas this week to try and find a solution to the crisis. The advantage of a process led by the trio is that Maduro might actually listen to them. The disadvantage is that El País reports their current plan involves direct negotiations between Maduro and Gonzalez. Negotiations that would cut out Maria Corina Machado and have therefore been rejected by the opposition. Another tool in the opposition's box could be to try and harness the mass protests. If they get big enough and carry on for long enough, they might demonstrate to other members of the government that Maduro has lost the regime's base and that a bloodless palace coup could be in order. As the Center for Strategic and International Studies writes, the protests send the message that the Venezuelan people will not submit to such obscene cheating and that those in the streets are not only the opposition, Venezuela is in the streets. The question, though, is how long the demonstrators can keep going. After a decade of economic crisis and soaring crime, normal Venezuelans may be angry, but they're also busy just trying to scrape by, and few people want to risk everything for a mass movement that fails. For his part, Crisis Group suggests that Maduro's tactic will be to, quote, batten down the hatches and try to ride out the storm. This will involve both repression and spinning wild tales of international plots against him, but it'll also involve just refusing to budge and hoping the international community will get tired and give up before he does. If that's the case, then we might expect the coming weeks to unfold less like the successful protests this year in Bangladesh and more like the 2020 protests in Belarus, where an aging autocrat came close to toppling but managed to cling on through a combination of brute violence and support from international allies, in this case Russia. Yet following such a strategy is risky for Maduro. Crisis Group indicates that even many hardcore Chavistas were annoyed that Maduro ran again instead of making way for new blood. If he is forced to fight tooth and nail just to stop a revolution, he may wind up being fatally weakened. Sadly for Venezuela, such an outcome may not really matter. The question isn't whether Maduro might be quietly removed from power in a year or two, but whether the election results are respected today. Whether the country can return to the democratic path it left so long ago. If the answer turns out to be no, if the regime manages to survive these mass protests, then the knock-on effects could be felt across the Americas. In the last decade alone, about 8 million Venezuelans, over a quarter of the population, fled as their nation imploded, a tide of humanity surging towards the relative safety of regional neighbors. Today, Colombia alone plays host to 3 million Venezuelan refugees. Another million live in Brazil, 800,000 in the US, many having crossed the border illegally. Already, social tensions are growing around the refugees. Fairly or unfairly, the think tank Chatham House reports that locals blame them for surges in crime. Yet this may be just the start of the exodus. Prior to the vote, polling by the firm Mega-Analysis showed that up to 40% of the remaining population was thinking about emigrating should Maduro be re-elected. That's millions and millions of people who might attempt to cross into Brazil or Colombia, ratcheting up local anger. Or he might flee to the US, creating a major border crisis in an already tense election year. Clearly, the international community has skin in the game of convincing Maduro to respect the election results. And there are ways outside countries might help. One major one, as distasteful as it might seem, could be to offer Maduro immunity from prosecution. Right now, the autocrat is wanted in the US on drug trafficking charges and may soon be indicted by the International Criminal Court for the killing of protesters in 2017. The magazine America's Quarterly explains things this way. What Maduro and his allies fear most is not losing power per se, but spending the rest of their lives in a supermax federal prison in the United States. Should Maduro and his cronies be offered sweeping immunity, as well as one-way tickets to, say, Cuba, it might remove one incentive for them to cling to power. Whether Venezuelans who've suffered at the hands of the regime could accept such a deal, though, that's another story. At the end of all that, then, this is where things stand at the time of recording. With a Venezuela that feels like it is on the brink, with a massive political crisis overwhelming the nation, but with seemingly no easy way out. No easy way to make sure the tyrants who just stole an election could be convinced to step down without any more bloodshed. Obviously, events are moving fast right now. It could be that some solution will present itself in the coming days, even if it is as simple as a military coup or a revolution. But amid all the uncertainty that lies ahead, the one thing we should never forget are the Venezuelan people themselves. People who've now lived for a decade or more in a nation in a state of collapse. People who've been immiserated and locked up by the regime, now trying to cling to power. For their sakes alone, we can only pray that a solution is found, that Maduro is convinced to stand aside so this once proud country might be able to, at last, start rebuilding again.